All right, hello, and it's silverkyle, and today I am going to be reviewing The Empire of the Vampire by J. Kristoff. And this is book one of a series. The sequel is actually coming out pretty soon in March of 2024. So I wanted to prepare myself by reading this first book here. And it's quite a thick book. It's 730 pages, I believe, in the hardcover. And I kind of went back and forth with this. So let's go into non-spoiler review, and then we'll go into a few spoilers near the end, but I'm not going to go into any major stuff, but I'll make it very apparent when we get to that section. So what we have here is a story where 27 years ago, we had our last real sunrise. The sun still kind of shows up, but it's very cloudy and it's not like it used to be. The sun doesn't come up clearly throughout the entire day anymore. And this has allowed vampires to run rampant in this world. They have basically taken over where there's only a few main cities that can hold them back at bay. And they go through every other small village and essentially eat up everybody or turn them for their armies of the dead. What we get through this is that we have Gabriel as the main character, and he is a silver saint, which means that he's part of the Silver Order and is one of the few, I guess, people in this world that can actually stand up against the vampires, because they do have similar strengths that a vampire would. They essentially have certain magics that they can use. They use holy water as well. The general things that you would have for a vampire story. They have, but they also have the strength that a vampire would, the speed sometimes. And they have to get this power, they have to kind of absorb vampire blood in a specific way, so that they can use this power. So they don't have it necessarily at all times, but they are definitely stronger than the normal mortal human. And what we get is Gabriel explains all of this by being interviewed by a historian, essentially. And we are told this story, narrated essentially by Gabriel throughout the entire book. And I know that this is a form of storytelling, but it really was quite jarring to me, as every paragraph is very much him explaining what happened. And it just didn't feel like it was what I would enjoy. I like living in the present. Usually I rarely like going to the past, but it's also very strange having somebody explain to the historian and essentially the reader of what's taking place and what's going on. And you're sometimes confused on if he's talking to the historian right now, or if he's actually like saying verbatim what was being said during conversations that he had throughout this entire story. So that was one of my main complaints. But outside of that, this is actually a pretty darn good story. There were times where I was kind of like, I don't like the writing here. It's just not jiving with me. But I continued on this entire thing because the story itself is interesting. The characters are kind of interesting as well, but I liked the setting of this world. And Gabriel kind of goes through a few specific moments throughout his life. He goes through his upbringing in his childhood to slowly become a teenager, and then eventually getting recruited as a Silver Saint, going through the training processes, and then eventually into a tale that's a little bit closer to the present time, like it's only a few years ago. And that's where the main meat of this story is from a few years ago, because there's something specific that the historian is looking for. And that's where that tale is. Now, I also didn't like kind of flip-flopping back and forth, because he'll talk about a little bit about the present or the story from a few years ago. And then he'll go into when he was a child, and then he'll go into the present again, or closer to the present. And then he'll go to when he was being trained, and then as a child. Like he goes back and forth, and I kind of wish that it would have followed a much more straightforward story chronologically. That's generally what I prefer. It did work in some instances, because something is revealed and you're like, oh, that makes sense now. And because you're talking about it in the past, it certainly worked in certain aspects, but I still think I would have preferred starting from the beginning and going to the end and not have it being narrated by Gabriel. I just would have liked to have been in that moment, but some people might like this a little bit more than others. And there also might be other authors that have done this before to a better degree than J. Kristoff. For me, it felt jarring, but I can totally see people really appreciating it. With this writing as well, it is extremely adult-like. There is swearing profusely throughout this, and while I enjoy swearing very much, I felt that it got to be a little bit too much. Like, I enjoy a good swear quite a bit, but the more that you throw the F-bomb out numerous times, it really loses its appeal. It loses its power that it has. So while times I'm like, okay, this is kind of funny, and what Gabriel says, because he's very sarcastic and swears quite a bit, I enjoyed it sometimes, but it felt to just be a little bit too much. And I know that might throw some people off. It also might interest a lot of people as well. So it really depends on which category you end on. Eventually, he was swearing and I didn't care, either positive or negatively. I just kind of went on and I just wanted to get to the story, essentially. It is also extremely gory. And I mean, not necessarily in a bad way. It fits this world. This tone, the tone and atmosphere that you get from this world does very much feel like a hopeless world where vampires have completely taken over, and it's dire. It is extremely dark, and that's what a book like this should have. So to me, that felt very much at home. I just know that some people might not necessarily like a ton of gore, a ton of violence, a ton of swearing necessarily in this book, but it's an adult book, and a lot of the themes fit very well for this kind of world that Jay Kristoff has created. Overall, I would probably give this a 3 out of 5 stars. It's on the cusp of being really good, and I feel it's more so the writing that pulled it back for me. If this was written in a chronological order, or mainly just that it wasn't narrated by Gabriel and we just followed him as he went along throughout this journey, I really do believe I would have liked it a lot more. But I can totally also see on the opposite end that people might love the writing style of Jay Kristoff in The Empire of the Vampire here. So that's my non-spoiler review, 3 stars out of 5. We'll go into a few spoilers because I thought that it was kind of fun. I absolutely love his sword. His sword talks to him. And there are moments, and his sword is kind of crazy, and he's always telling his sword to kind of shut up and to kind of say you're going a little bit too far, and he just sheds, anytime that he's not holding it and sheds it, he no longer is able to, the sword is no longer able to talk. But the sword is comical at times, not making a lot of sense. And you're always wondering why. One of the parts, I think the sword might be my favorite character in this entire book. But at one point, the sword, Gabriel is talking to the sword and saying, I think it's called Ashbringer. I can't remember what it's called. But he says that, okay, open your eyes. You need to see this. And you like to pay attention because it keeps talking about random stuff. You'll just get into a random conversation. And then we wait a little bit. There's 3 dots. And then the sword says, I have no eyes. It whispers to him like, I have no eyes. I can't. It was just so good. I laughed quite a bit at that. I really enjoyed that aspect. And what we find out later on is that Gabriel had lost his wife and his child when an extremely powerful vampire showed up in an extremely tense scene. And it's kind of building this up throughout this entire book that this is going to happen, because he keeps talking about his child and his wife. And the more that you read it, the more that you go along, he's really not he just keeps saying that they're home. And it's because they have since passed, actually been murdered. And when Gabriel confronted this vampire, he tried to kill it with the sword, but the sword broke. And that really messed up with the sword, and that's why the sword is almost broken. Like it's able to speak, but it's always kind of confused and just says random stuff at times. And it sounds like it was not like that before this engagement. And it's there's one specific moment where it apologizes to Gabriel for saying, I'm so sorry. And it begins stuttering, and it stutters throughout the entire novel afterwards. Like when you're reading from a few years ago, when it's talking, it's always stuttering, and it's because that it was broken. And I really felt just horrible for what this sword went through. And it apologizes to Gabriel for not being able to kill the vampire as it's stuttering to him. And it's just such a moment where I felt connected and I felt empathy for a sword. That is a great author, for you to feel bad for a sword is impressive to me. Yeah, great stuff. I really do feel like the sword is my favorite character. And there's also like the Holy Grail is essentially a person. It's this a female teenager that we think is a boy for the longest time. So that's a little twist. Had a nice little twist about that. I did like that character, and she has gone through some definitely big things in her life as well, and everybody keeps leaving her. And that's what we kind of build towards with her and Gabriel, that eventually he's trying to leave her as well, but eventually he says, no, I'm going to continue following along with this character and save her, even though it means that potentially draining her blood would allow for the sun to come back throughout this ritual. But he's like, you can't sacrifice this person without her even knowing, is what basically the Silver Order was going to do. Good stuff. I'm kind of curious to see where they go from here. So I will be picking up the second novel. It's just, the writing is just was a little bit hard for me to kind of get through. Oh, and there's a bunch of pictures too throughout this book too. So let's see if I can find, just for the sake of it, some pictures. When I look at the pictures though, sometimes it looks very like, this is not like Twilight. It does seem like a little bit of something that like would be suited for that kind of an audience. But the material itself in here is not like that at all. It's very mature setting, gore, swearing, sex. It's all running rampant here in a very mature world. So that is The Empire of the Vampire. Let me know in the comments below if you have read that before. And thank you all for watching. You have been bearded in Beardage.